Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. We are returning to take another look at President Obama's speech July 17th in South Africa, where he delivered the annual Nelson Mandela Lecture, which was essentially in praise of globalization and praise of the achievements of global capitalism. And he does point out some of the problems. But we're going to talk about just what he thinks the achievements have been and how real are they. Now we're going to play a clip from that speech to give you a bit of a taste of it.
And with these geopolitical changes came sweeping economic changes. The introduction of market-based principles in which previously closed economies, along with the forces of global integration powered by new technologies, suddenly unleashed entrepreneurial talents to those that once had been relegated to the periphery of the world economy, who hadn't counted. Suddenly they counted. They had some power. They had the possibilities of doing business. And then came scientific breakthroughs and new infrastructure and the reduction of armed conflicts. And suddenly 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty. And once starving nations were able to feed themselves. And infant mortality rates plummeted. And meanwhile, the spread of the internet made it possible for people to connect across oceans. And cultures and continents instantly were brought together. And potentially all the world's knowledge could be in the hands of a small child in even the most remote village. And now an entire generation has grown up in a world that by most measures has gotten steadily freer and healthier and wealthier and less violent and more tolerant during the course of their lifetimes.
Now, joining us from Geneva to discuss President Obama's speech is Heiner Flassbeck. He's the director of Flassbeck Economics, a consultancy for global macroeconomic questions, and the editor of Macroscope, an international magazine. Heiner is the former chief of macroeconomics and development of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, known by people that know of it as UNCTAD. He's also co-author of the book Against the Troika, Crisis and Austerity in the Eurozone, which he wrote with Kostas Lapavitsas. Thanks for joining us again, Heiner.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let's unpack the sort of big claim of President Obama in the segment we just played, which essentially that more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. First of all, my understanding of that stat is it's, first of all, we're lifted out of extreme poverty, which is sort of a World Bank claim and some others. But the measure of extreme global poverty is people that make less than $1.90 a day. If you make $1.95 a day, you've been lifted out of global poverty. So, I mean, what is do you think the reality of, has something really been achieved over these decades of globalization? I'm assuming he's talking more or less from the 80s on. So what do you make of Obama's claims?
Yeah, let's take the last 30 years. Definitely, if you look at the world as a whole, the average of the world, you find some achievements which could be expected. Whether it's due to globalization or whether to other things is difficult to say, but these numbers have to be taken with caution, because if you take China out of that picture for the last 30 years, then of the 1 million people that have been lifted out of poverty,
1 billion's the claim, yeah.
1 billion, only 500 million remain, because at least 500 million were in China. And we all know China is a big success story, no doubt about it. Their people have really improved their lives, but it is not typical for the rest of the world. It's not typical for Africa, not for Latin America, and not for India. Everywhere there has been a bit of progress, but overall, over 30 years, this is not a big success story. It's a Chinese story, plus a little bit of improvement elsewhere, but many chances have been missing.
But Obama's arguing that it's the adoption of market-based principles that are responsible for the achievements. And one could say that is what China did. They've adopted, over these last 30 years, market-based principles.
No doubt about it. I'm not opposing market-based principles, but China, you have a very untypical economy for, say, in comparison to the rest of the world and in comparison to many other developing countries. And China, you have a very strong government, you have a very strong intervention of the government, you have a steered economy that is strongly steered every day by the government, by a communist party, not to forget. And so far, this is not the success story of the world. The success story of the world is much more what could have been happening in Africa, where it did not happen, only in a very few countries with commodities or so. But many countries have been hindered by the kinds of Obama and his administration and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to develop in a much better way, because there were so to say, the whole development was imposed. They imposed a kind of neoliberal approach on it, which was really disastrous in many cases. We had Asian crisis, we had Latin American crisis, we had Eastern European crisis. So and we had the big financial crisis, not to forget, at the end of these 30 years. So to make the big success story is, in my view, absolutely not justified.
If you just unpack this poverty number again, am I understanding it correctly that the claim of 1 billion people out of poverty means 1 billion people now make more than $1.90 a day? I mean, the whole kind of treatment of what poverty is. For example, impoverished people in Baltimore who live in neighborhoods with boarded up housing and a large amount of crime and deteriorating schools. But they wouldn't even be considered living in poverty if you use the kind of criteria that Obama is using for people lifting out. I mean, people in Baltimore are living on more than $1.90 a day. So by this definition, they're not even in extreme poverty.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Obama mentioned in his speech, he mentions inequality and some other problems, inequality in particular. But this measurement of poverty, absolute poverty, is called absolute poverty, which is the $1.90 per day. This is really not very helpful. And poverty is always a relative concept. Poverty depends on the overall wealth of an economy and those that have been left out of the increasing wealth. And so far, even people with $100 a day can be poor in relative terms compared to the rest of their economy. And so far, this doesn't mean very much. It's so to say a measure that would tell you, well, less people are hungry in this world. But if you look around, there's still millions of people and kids who are hungry every day. And this is the real scandal, because the means would have been there to feed them all in a reasonable way and to improve their lives so that they really have more than $1 in terms of real goods that they have at their disposal.
As you mentioned, Obama does recognize the inequality that has developed in the context of this, what he considers great achievements. Here's a couple of clips of Obama's speech again.
Economic opportunity for all the magnificence of the global economy, all the shining skyscrapers that have transformed the landscape around the world. Entire neighborhoods, entire cities, entire regions, entire nations have been bypassed. In other words, for far too many people, the more things have changed, the more things stayed the same. And the result of all these trends has been an explosion in economic inequality. It's meant that a few dozen individuals control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of humanity. That's not an exaggeration, that's a statistic.
Heiner, he's recognizing a reality of the world, which I think is in complete contradiction with his claims in the beginning of how wonderful global capitalism and globalization has been. All that being said, what's the record of his own administration when it comes to dealing with this inequality?
Yeah, I was really surprised to read all these acknowledgments, so to say, of what has not been achieved. I was very close to his administration when I was working in the United Nations, and we tried to do many things to improve exactly what he mentions, but his administration blocked it all. Let me give you 3 examples. One example was I was at the forefront of a study group dealing with commodity speculation of agricultural commodities. That means foodstuff. And we tried to convince the leaders of the world, including his administration, something had to be done because people, and these are the handful of people that he's talking about, are enriching themselves scrupulously at the expense of the poorest who cannot afford their food anymore.
So let's just make this concrete for people. This kind of speculation that takes place is artificially driving the price of food up and making it unaffordable.
Yeah, it was unaffordable. In 2008, we had a big crisis of food, including all the other crises, but there was also a crisis of food because the food prices were driven up by what was called the financialization of the market. Wall Street guys who pushed the prices of commodities. Now this is over, this collapsed after 5 years, but 5 years is too long for the people to survive. And so his administration blocked it from the very beginning. They didn't want us to deal with it, and they never did anything to support our effort.
And then you're right, and those would have been to limit how much speculation can take place on food supplies.
Yeah, in particular on food stuff, sure.
And what you said there were 3 examples. What are the others?
Yeah, the second example was speculation in currencies. Brazil at a certain time was, so to say, flooded by speculative money, so-called carry trade, that appreciated the Brazilian currency in the first years of the century, and to a point where Brazil was really couldn't breathe anymore. Brazilian industry couldn't breathe anymore. And the Brazilian finance minister was speaking about currency war out there against his country. And we tried to put up discussion here in the World Trade Organization about this topic. And the US administration under Obama blocked it from the very beginning. When I was speaking and I was saying that what is at stake and what really happened, the US guy went out of the room and they never commented on anything. And they, I'm absolutely sure, I cannot prove this exactly, but they urged the representatives from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the OECD not to say any substantive word on this matter. The third point is UNCTAD fought for a long time for what we call policy space. That is more room of maneuver for developing countries to do economic policy, just the kind of economic policy that the industrial countries are doing all the time, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and so on. And again, this was opposed by the Obama administration, and this went so far that the Obama administration even tried to cut down the mandate of UNCTAD to prevent UNCTAD from taking up this kind of topics and to be a competition to the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah, so that's what's so disingenuous about the speech, is that he has a very sophisticated understanding of how this whole process has worked. He gets how destructive it has also been, but he acts like somehow it's completely out of anyone's control why these things happen. And maybe in some way it is, in the sense that finance has accumulated so much wealth and so much political power that maybe it kind of is out of the hands of the political forces that are capable of taking control in Washington.
Yeah, so you could have said, you could have said in that speech, oh, I learned all this in the last 2 or 3 years, unfortunately only. Or he could have said, oh, I was forced by the financial industry to pick Larry Summers as my main economic advisor. That would have been an honest statement, so to say, and that would have shown what is going on in this world. But he just complains about the big powers. But he was the most powerful man in the world. Everybody says, at least, maybe it's not true, but that's what everybody believes. And he did nothing on the whole economic side. He did nothing to oppose the mainstream. He did nothing to oppose neoliberalism. He did nothing to oppose this monopoly creation all over the world. He did nothing to oppose, in particular, this is absolutely crucial, the financial industries, the so-called financial industries. He was the one, with others, also the other presidents before, Clinton was exactly the same, but they protected Wall Street against any critique, only critique from outside, not to speak about measures to cut down the power.
And in this speech, he talks about the rise of right populism, and inferring Trump, but also other right-wing movements in Europe. And he acts as if somehow, again, this is some, out of anyone's control. This is just a consequence of the global economy and such. But clearly, the inequality exploded under his administration. And as you mentioned, a process that Clinton, of course, George Bush following Clinton, even more exaggerated it. But this economic inequality was not fought under the Obama administration, and certainly seeded the soil for the rise of Trump.
Yeah, sure. And the right is taking this issue successfully because the left has given it up. The so-called left, what people call the left, the Democrats consider to be left, but they have given up the fight against inequality in their own countries. So everybody likes, all of the world, everybody talks about inequality and how bad it is, and that what has developed, and so few people are so powerful. He gives the example, Obama gives the example of 5 people owning as much as half of the world or so. All these silly things, it's true, but if you ask them, so why don't you do anything about it? Why don't you even ask for higher taxes? He's not asking for higher taxes. Why is he not asking for higher taxes for the rich? Why is he not asking for kind of control, a better control of monopolies? Why is he not asking for concrete measures to demolish the big powers that have developed in all over the world in the global economy?
All right, thanks very much for joining us, Heiner.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.